I'm Kathy Smith, the director of the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society here at Community College of Philadelphia. Today's Perspectives interview is conducted by David Travaskis, who is an adjunct faculty member here and the pro bono counsel for the Pennsylvania Bar Association. He's also a member of the Center's advisory board. In today's interview, David speaks to Angus Love. Mr. Love is the executive director of the PA Institutional Law Project and serves as a civil legal aid attorney for the nearly 98,000 Pennsylvanians in the correctional system. Mr. Love speaks powerfully about the failure of the zero-tolerance policies of the past and the need for innovation in the justice system.
Welcome to the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society Perspectives series on CCP TV, the educational channel of the Community College of Philadelphia. I'm David Travaskis, an adjunct professor in the Paralegal Studies program here at the college. Today it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, Angus Love, the executive director of the Pennsylvania Institutional Law Project. Angus, welcome to the show.
Good morning, David, and thank you for having me on.
Now, can you tell our audience what is the Pennsylvania Institutional Law Project?
Certainly. The Pennsylvania Institutional Law Project is the legal aid provider for over 100,000 individuals in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania who are institutionalized. 95% of them are in prisons and jails. We provide free civil legal services to those individuals.
So you guys basically represent prisoners.
Yes.
And as a society, I know a lot of people watching us are saying, why should prisoners have rights for civil legal aid? We're not talking about their criminal cases. We're not talking about their appeals, whether or not they're guilty or not guilty. These are civil cases they're bringing.
Well, our mission is to provide access to the courts for these individuals, to have a truly viable legal system. Anyone who has a legal problem should be able to access the court system in order to achieve a just solution. That shouldn't depend on whether you're in jail or in a mental institute, or you're homeless, or you're disabled, or you're illiterate. Anyone with a legitimate legal problem should be able to access the legal system. Now, we have 100,000 potential clients, and we have 3.5 attorneys, so it's not a huge effort, but we feel that it's extremely important that there be some avenue for the individuals who are institutionalized, if they have a legitimate case, to be able to access the court system.
So what are the kinds of cases you get?
We get a wide variety of civil cases, as you mentioned. It's everything other than the criminal cases and the criminal appeals. It can range from a will problem to a family law problem to a benefits problem, or all the way up to class actions for deplorable conditions, other special circumstances. We do a lot of cases that involve violations of constitutional rights, primarily the 8th Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment. If you've been beaten up by a guard, you would have an 8th Amendment claim. If you've been deliberately indifferent to your medical needs, you would have an 8th Amendment claim. If you've been sexually assaulted by a guard, you would have an 8th Amendment claim. There are some First Amendment claims, the ability to access the courts, freedom of religion are two, and occasionally a 4th Amendment claim involving privacy, although that's very limited in the prison context.
Now, you were talking about you do class actions. Can you just explain for our audience what a class action is?
Well, when you have the same problem coming in over and over again, there is an ability to bring a case on behalf of a class of people instead of an individual. One case that we did involved a halfway house up in Northeast Philadelphia called Coleman Hall. A fellow came in who was arrested on a domestic dispute charge involving his ex-wife. And he was an epileptic, and he was supposed to take 1,400 cc's of Dilantin a day. When he was picked up on a bench warrant, he had his medication in the car, but they wouldn't let him use it. It was around noon. They took him to a holding cell for 4 or 5 hours. Then they took him to Coleman Hall. He continually asked for his medication. He didn't get it. He asked for a lower bunk when he got to Coleman Hall. They didn't give it to him. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, they gave him 200 cc's of his medication, but it wasn't enough. Midnight, he had a seizure, fell off the top bunk, and had to be hospitalized. So we thought that was a pretty good case. And then a couple weeks later, another guy comes in, same institution. He says, I'm a lifelong asthmatic. I had an asthma attack. I went to the front desk and said, I'm having an asthma attack. They said, here's your pass. The hospital's 2 miles down the road, walk. So he had to walk in the throes of an asthmatic attack 2 miles to the Temple emergency room. Then another guy came in with a similar situation, and we thought, well, what's going on here? So we looked around, we asked questions, and we found that this halfway house believed that they didn't have any obligation to provide any medical care to the residents. They said that the medical problems will be taken by, quote unquote, community care, i.e. go out, get a Medicare card, and get your own medical treatment. And we said, well, that may be good in certain circumstances, but other people like coming in don't have a card, they have immediate needs. Other people are confined to the institution because of disciplinary actions, and other people need medication as soon as they come in. So we said that's not good enough. So we filed a class action saying you have to have some level of medical care for emergencies, for intake, for people who can't leave the institution, and eventually it led to a settlement, and now they have medical care.
So all halfway houses have to have their own medical care?
Well, that case was just pertinent to Coleman Hall, but I think it sets a precedent, and others keep an eye on things, and they generally, I think, follow suit, knowing that if they don't, they're going to be subject to the same kind of litigation.
Now, I know one of the things right now you're working on is working on people who are mentally ill in prison and their rights. Can you
Yes.
talk to us a little bit about that?
This is something that's going on nationally, and for those of you old enough to remember, JFK started the deinstitutionalization movement in the 60s. The idea was to close the state centers and the state hospitals. The state centers were for people with mental retardation, and the state hospitals were for people mentally ill, and to put them into community placements where they would be cheaper and better able to adjust and progress in their lives. It worked very well with the mentally retarded. They closed Pennhurst. They moved into these small community living arrangements, 3, 4 people in a house, and get a job in a workshop, and they've done extremely well. But on the other side, the mental illness side has not gone well at all. If you recall, here in Philadelphia, we had Byberry, we had Haverford State Hospital, we had Norristown State Hospital. There were thousands of people in these institutions. Byberry closed, Haverford closed, Norristown's down to a couple hundred people. So they tried to move these folks into the community. The money wasn't there. They didn't adjust well to the setting. They ended up being kicked out of whatever place they were in. They often ended up on the street, homeless. And then they start picking up small quality of life crimes, public urination, disorderly conduct, petty theft. And then after a while, these added up, and they get hit with these habitual offender statutes. Once you committed 3, 4, 5 convictions, you start going upstate. And then when they got into the state prison system, the prisons weren't really designed to handle mentally ill people, and they would commit infractions of the rules because they weren't used to the regimentation that prison life has, and then they end up in solitary confinement. And in solitary confinement, they start decomposing because of the stringent circumstances, 23 hours a day in your cell with little stimulation or any kind of activity. And so they end up, horrible things start happening, suicide, self-mutilation, just terrible, terrible things. And this population has just grown over the last couple decades to a very significant portion of the state population. There may be 10, 15,000 people in the state system of 52,000 who have mentally ill problems, and there's several hundred, maybe 1,000 that have severe mental illness that are locked up in these cages and decomposing. So we put together an effort with a number of other legal organizations. The Disability Rights Network took the lead. They're a nonprofit legal organization such as ourselves. We got the ACLU of Pennsylvania on board. We got 2 private firms, the firm of Carries and Rudofsky and the Covington and Burling, a big firm in New York and in Washington. And together we put our resources together. We hired experts. We had the ability to go in because of a federal statute before the filing of the suit and interview potential clients, get their medical records, have them examined. And we felt very confident going in that there was a need for a major shift in policy in Pennsylvania. And this is happening elsewhere in other states. So we filed, and to the credit of the department, they immediately recognized the importance of this issue, the fact that they could do this better. So they immediately said they would enter into settlement negotiations, which is where we currently are. One of the first things they did, to their credit, was to add mental illness as a criteria in the disciplinary process within the state prison system. So if an individual commits an infraction of the rules, his mental illness will be taken into consideration when they offer a punishment. Now, the next thing we're looking for is to try to keep these folks out of the solitary confinement units and into treatment units, but that's a tougher sell. At the same time we're filing, the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has also seen this as a problem. I talked to their former chief, Thomas Perez. I think he's now the Secretary of Labor, and he agreed to come on board with their attorneys. And so they filed not a legal action, it's a letter of intent and under the Institutionalized Persons Act. And we're just now working to combine forces with the Department of Justice to get as many reforms as we can in the state system. The prison system, again, has responded positively. They're going to designate a couple prisons just for the severely mentally ill, a larger section of prisons for the mentally ill, and try to put them in areas and then bring in more staff, psychiatrists, psychologists, and work treatment into the daily routine of these folks.
So it does sound like you get a response when you bring your litigation.
Not always, but in this particular time, absolutely. There was an excellent article in the New York Times Sunday edition a few weeks ago by Nicholas Kristof, one of their top columnists, saying that we've basically criminalized mental illness. And it's really an inadvertent consequence of this deinstitutionalization movement that these folks have sadly and silently just shifted into prisons. And so we're becoming more aware of this problem, and we're taking steps to address it.
Well, this goes to actually the very existence of your organization. When lay people think about prison, I think most people's attitude is, good, those people did something bad, they should be there, throw away the key, let's not worry about them.
Right. There was an old Richard Pryor joke about justice or just us. In other words, he goes to prison and he sees all African Americans. He says, oh, it's just us in prison, instead of being a dispenser of justice. And then he said, but then there's some people there who need to be there, and I wouldn't want them out in a heartbeat. And that's true. But sadly enough, there's been a tremendous boom in prison population and prison construction. Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, when I started in 1980, had 8,000 inmates and a budget of $200 million. Today, they have 52,000 inmates and a budget over $2 billion. So there's been this explosion in the use of incarceration as a method of social control. And so we have 27 prisons now when we had 8 prisons back when I started. So that has made things extremely difficult all across the board.
Well, and what's the alternative? What's the answer, do you think?
Well, one of the consequences of this, as I mentioned, they've captured a lot of mentally ill people in this population that used to be in state hospitals, and they've also captured a lot of druggies. The drug war, a lot of people such as myself think it's a colossal failure. That's up for debate, but they certainly have captured a huge amount of druggies. When I started out in this business, drug offenders were like 1% of the population. Now they're a third. So you have a lot of people, which I consider nonviolent people, in prison because of possession of marijuana or something like this, which I don't think should warrant incarceration, but it does. And so you have maybe, I would say, a third to a half of the people in prison are violent offenders who should be there. But you have a large portion of mentally ill, a large portion of druggies, and other substance abuse, alcohol, that could be, in my opinion, probably better treated in a treatment modality, which they once were prior to this mass incarceration movement.
Now, let's talk a little bit more about some of the cases that you've had, because you've been doing this a long time, as you said, since 1980. What are some of the cases that stand out to you and may be of interest to our audience?
Well, there's one, the Philadelphia prison system is a good case close to home, up on State Road. My view of the prison system is that the cities have the most trouble running an efficient prison system because they have the smallest tax base. The state has a larger tax base. The federal government has a larger tax base. So they have more resources to draw for the prison system. But in a city like Philadelphia or any big city in the United States, you have a lot of people on public assistance, this, that, and the other thing, and then you have a large prison population, but you don't have a huge tax base. So it really puts a lot of pressure on the budget. And in Philadelphia, it's been an ongoing battle since 1978. There's been litigation over the conditions of confinement in the Philadelphia prison system. There was the Jackson versus Hendricks case filed in 1978 by David Rudofsky. Then there was the Harris versus Pernsley case filed in, say, 1990 by David Richmond of Pepper Hamilton. Before Judge Shapiro, that led to a cap being placed on the prison population. Those cases were long-standing over conditions of confinement, number of people in prison. They just seemed to never end. The city often paid fines rather than fix things because that was cheaper. And then there was a bill passed in 1996 called the Prisoner Litigation Reform Act, which gave great relief to prison systems such as Philadelphia to get out from under court orders. The feeling in Congress was that prisons were being run by the courts instead of administrators, so they made it much easier for them to get out from under court orders. It worked. Those cases ended. But then conditions just continued to get worse. And the Philadelphia prison system was up to almost 10,000 people a few years back. They had there was a room maybe the size of this area here with 30 or 40 people in the intake unit sleeping on a concrete floor for up to a week waiting for cells. And we brought that case, the Bowers case, and the judge ruled it was barbaric conditions. It couldn't be allowed to exist. And then they kind of just moved the problem from the intake unit into the prison by beginning to triple cell. These prison cells were built initially for one, then they were double celled, and now they're moving on to triple celling. The cells aren't big enough for 3 beds, so at night they throw down this plastic banana boat. It looks like the thing that my kids go sledding in. And an inmate will sleep on the floor in this plastic boat at night, and then in the day put it up against the wall. We felt this was excessive, and we filed a class action against them. Again, myself, Disability Rights Network, and Carries and Rudofsky and Pepper Hamilton law firm filed this action, the Williams case. And miraculously, the population dropped down to about 7,500 after we had filed. And then we said, okay, fine, we'll settle. We'll monitor the situation, and you know, we're doing the right thing, getting rid of triple celling, and that's all we're asking for. And then the Inquirer did a series on the court system. I'm sure you remember it, an expose of sorts, and they said you have 47,000 outstanding bench warrants in Philadelphia, you know, this and that, leniency in major crimes, on and on. So the system kind of reacted to that and started bringing people in with bench warrant court and this and that. Population went back up over 9,000. We reinstated the lawsuit, brought in our experts, toured the facility, and now we're getting ready for trial. As we don't believe triple celling is the answer.
Well, and this idea of triple cells, I know people watching this are thinking, again, they deserve it. Why should we care about prisoners? But when you talk about 3 adult men in a cell, which is how big?
80 square feet at most. You know, it's like a large closet for some.
Which really is. I mean, the 8 by 10
Yeah.
is just an amazing thing to have 3 adult men in there.
And on top of that, sadly enough, the city has trouble staffing the institutions. They have something called restricted movement. When enough guards call in sick on a day, they declare restricted movement, and you're not allowed to leave your cell. You're not allowed to go out for recreation or whatever in the day room because they don't have enough guards. And this happens quite frequently. There's turnover. They don't fill the positions. They're trying to save money. And so that compounds the problem, and they end up spending more time in their cells. And then violence occurs, medical situations occur.
Well, if what you were saying is true, you have half the population are violent offenders, a third of the population are mentally ill people. Yeah. And if we get a cell where you have somebody mentally ill with somebody who's violent and we're in there all day in 80 square feet,
there's going to be problems.
Bad could happen.
Yes.
The person who's watching this now and thinking about jailhouse lawyers and those kind of things, what's your response to them? I mean, people are saying we burden the court because the prisoners have 24/7, they can file, they can do all these things.
It's a very controversial topic, and there's 2 or 3 ways to look at it. You know, we're lawyers, and we have licenses, and then there's these people, jailhouse lawyers, that don't have licenses, and they're basically practicing law, and the profession would say that's wrong. But I would say that with 100,000 potential clients and 3 lawyers, I can't cover all the situations that exist that need a lawyer. So jailhouse lawyers, to me, fill that void. So in that sense, I think it's a good thing if they're ethical and they learn their craft, which many of them have. The other issue is the filing of frivolous lawsuits. That was addressed in this Prisoner Litigation Reform Act. And I have to admit, before this act, you could file a lawsuit and not have to pay the filing fee because you were indigent, and you would get a waiver of the filing fee because you were indigent. And it did lead to abuses. Certain people filed endless lawsuits over.
Right, I'm in prison,
Yeah.
I have nothing else to
Right.
do, it'll become my hobby, I'll keep filing.
And you got to make life miserable for the guard on the block or whoever. So yes, there were abuses. But the Prisoner Litigation Reform Act addressed that by forcing them to pay the filing fee, which I think is now up to $450. And so that's a huge amount of money for an inmate. So the act allows them to make installment payments. So they get paid between 17 and 47 cents an hour for their prison jobs. And every pay period, a portion of that goes to pay the filing fee. So it's a significant amount of money, and it was probably needed to curb the abuses, and it has significantly reduced the number of frivolous lawsuits.
Okay, now one of the things that we've talked a lot about on this show is the whole idea of what happens after prison, the whole idea of reentry. And you have said often that funny line about yours is the only office in town where having a criminal record probably is a good thing. But
Yes.
what do you want to talk about with reentry and this whole process?
When I started out in the business, there was something called rehabilitation. The idea was they're there, let's rehabilitate them so they don't come back. And that was the 70s and part of that whole era. And then the 80s and the 90s was let's get tough and not worry too much about what happens when they get there. And that led to the mass incarceration movement, the rise of the prison industrial complex, and it basically became warehousing. And then a lot of leaders, especially in the black community and the black clergy, said, you know, you're not doing us any favors here. You're bringing guys back to our community. They're worse off than when they went. They're angry. They've just spent time in what is essentially a crime school, trading stories on how to commit crimes, and come back and pillage our community. And we want you to do something about it. So thus, after 2000, the phrase reentry became in vogue, and now it's picking up steam, and pretty much everyone has agreed that reentry is an extremely important process. If you look at people coming out, 2/3 go back. For every single individual that you can stop from going back, you've prevented another crime from being committed. You hopefully have a tax-paying citizen, somebody who can be a family man or a woman involved in their family life, in their community. So every single person that you prevent from going back is a plus. So there's been a very welcome recognition of the need for reentry services. And there's been a number of model programs. Judges Restrepo and Rice started one in the federal court system with the U.S. Attorney's Office. The Pennsylvania Prison Society started a reentry program. The Mayor's Office, RISE, reentry program. And there's a number of other church-based reentry programs in Philadelphia that are doing an excellent job, taking people, mentoring them, showing them how to prepare for a job, helping them with job interviews, hopefully getting a job or an education, and staying out of trouble. And that's, I think, is an excellent thing that we have to look at these days.
Well, and it saves us, if they don't go back to prison, it saves us what we're spending on
Yes.
each inmate, which even when
Exactly.
we're doing 3 prisoners to a cell, we're spending somewhere between, what is it, $36,000 to $40,000
Yes.
a year?
Yes, and it's the most expensive thing you can do. If you put them in a drug and alcohol treatment thing or a mental health facility, it'd be far cheaper, or some outpatient facility, it'd be far cheaper than incarceration. Incarceration is the most expensive alternative there is.
Now, I have been talking about people who might be watching this who have negative views about prison and prisoners. We also have people watching this who have relatives in prison.
Right.
And if they have a relative in prison and there is some sort of problem, a civil problem, they're being abused by a guard, there's some other civil issue that arises, how can they reach out to you?
They can write us a letter. We have 3 offices. We have an office in Pittsburgh, we have an office in Lewisburg, and we have our office here in Philadelphia, 718 Art Street. Suite 304 South, 19106. We have a website you can go to, and we'll do the best we can to deal with the situation.
Now, are there other avenues for people to look at? You mentioned the Pennsylvania Prison Society.
I think that if you want to go beyond the individual problem, you should really look at the website for the Pennsylvania Prison Society. They're celebrating their 227th anniversary this year. They were founded in, I think, 1787, somewhere around there, by Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence. Several other prominent Philadelphians joined in at that time, including Benjamin Franklin. And they're advocating for more humane prison conditions. They have a law that allows them to visit any prison at any time if you're a volunteer for the organization. They do a lot of excellent advocacy and a lot of excellent service work in the prison context.
So now, if a citizen just wanted to get involved, that's the group they should get involved with?
I think so. Studies have shown that visits tend to help in the rehabilitation process. The closer ties you have to the community, family, friends, visitors, the more likely you are not to recidivate upon release.
Now, how often do you go into prisons in Pennsylvania, Angus?
Certainly once a month, sometimes sooner. It depends on the circumstances. Cases heat up, you have to go maybe every week. Depends, fortunately, a lot of times, we'll do telephone contact. There's efforts to bring along video conferencing, which is helpful, so we don't always have to go. Most of the prisons are upstate. It's a long ride, so we do whatever means are available to us to keep in touch.
And I have to tell you, when I visit a prison, I always have that sense after I'm out that I'm glad I'm out. But the conditions, I know things are rough there, but the conditions have gotten better. I can remember one of your big early class action lawsuits was to give prisoners the right to a clean change of underwear every couple of days, not even every day.
Yeah, no, I don't mean to be overly critical of the prison system. There's a lot of fine people in corrections doing a wonderful job. It's just that they're overburdened by the numbers. So modern corrections has come a long way from the old days, and there's a lot of not amenities, but the basic necessities of life are provided in a large part.
In our last few minutes that we have, what are the things that should be done? If you were in control, what are the things that you would say should be done?
The drug war, you have to look at the drug war and see, do we really need to lock up people for marijuana? 2 states have legal marijuana, 22 states have medical marijuana, yet here in Pennsylvania, we're still locking people up, and largely people of color. I think 9 out of 10 Philadelphians who get arrested for marijuana are people of color. So I think they should, not put people in jail for marijuana, decriminalize it. Other drugs, if it's a drug problem and the person's an addict, they'd be better off in a treatment setting than prison. So you get those people into treatment, and then you look at the mentally ill. We have to get them out of prison. I don't want to return to state hospitals, but they were better off in the state hospitals, in my opinion. I went up to Norristown State all the time, and it wasn't pleasant, but it was certainly better than being in a solitary confinement unit in a maximum security prison. I don't know quite the answer there, but I know that what they're doing is not the answer. Mandatory sentencing has put a straitjacket into the sentencing judges, whereas before they had discretion. They could look at the background, the circumstances. Now they have to just almost assembly line hand out sentences according to the mandatories. And I think we have to get rid of the mandatory. We have to return sentencing discretion back to the judges.
Well, this is really a lot for us to think about. I want to thank you for being with us today. This is all the time that we have. And I also want to thank everyone who's been watching for tuning in. You've been watching the Fox Rothschild Center for Law and Society's Perspectives series on CCP TV, the educational channel of the Community College of Philadelphia. I'm David Travaskis, an adjunct professor in the Paralegal Studies program. For more information, please contact us at the Community College, and we will see you next time on CCP TV.